Order. Order. I call Philip Davies to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr Gapes. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered the matter of male suicide and International Men's Day. And I would like to thank the colleagues across the House for supporting the holding of this debate, and also the Backbench Business Committee for finding time to hold the debate on International Men's Day itself. I'd also like to thank all the very many people who have been in touch with me to tell their story or to put forward their organisation's point of view. And I'm very grateful to all of them for taking the time to do that. Mr Gapes, I said in my maiden speech that I would campaign hard against the blight of political correctness, which is doing so much damage to our country. 10 years have passed, and I'm still here fighting this battle. Some of the most ludicrous cases of political correctness have reduced, but the more entrenched ones are still well and truly thriving. And one of the main areas where we see the pernicious effects of political correctness is when it comes to the treatment of men and women. And I heard about International Men's Day and decided that it was only right, given that we have a debate each year on International Women's Day, in the interests of gender parity, to try to appeal for time to be given for this debate to commemorate this day. The aims of International Men's Day are admirable. They are to promote positive male role models, not just movie stars and sportsmen, but everyday working-class men who are living decent, honest lives, to celebrate men's positive contributions to society, community, family, marriage, childcare and to the environment, to focus on men's health and well-being, social, emotional, physical and spiritual, to highlight discrimination against men in areas of social services, social attitudes and expectations and the law, and to improve gender relations and promote gender equality, and finally to create a safer, better world where people can be safe and grow to reach their full potentials. Of course I will.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and can I commend him for securing this as an important debate? And he's just outlined the importance of International Men's Day. Would he not share my disappointment that this debate should be held on the floor of the House of Commons rather than in the second chamber in Westminster Hall?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for coming to the debate and also for making that point. And yes, I would have preferred the debate to be in the main chamber, especially given as International Women's Day debate is held there too. But I'm grateful that we've got an opportunity to raise these issues, which we've never done before. So it would be churlish for me to be too critical, given that we've got the time for this debate today. But I want today to be the day that we in this House start to deal with some of the forgotten men's issues and realise why the political correctness which underpins issues relating to the differing treatment of the sexes can be damaging to men. Now, this might sound odd for someone leading a debate on International Men's Day, but in many respects, Mr Gapes, I would rather we did not have to be here to have this debate. Because when you think about it, in so many ways, considering men and women separately, as if they live lives in complete isolation to each other, is ridiculous. Neither group is isolated. Both sexes have mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, uncles and aunts, grandmothers and grandfathers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends. So for every woman there are related male parties and therefore a vested interest in men's issues. The problem is that in virtually everything we do in this House and debate in this House seems to start with the premise that everything is biased against women and something must be done about it. Never an appreciation that men's issues can be just as important and that men can be just as badly treated in certain areas as women. My honourable friend, the member for Belfast East, supported my request for a debate, and I know he is very sorry that he unfortunately could not be here today to join in. But had he been here, no doubt he would have shared the fact that last year Belfast City Council hosted its first event to mark International Men's Day. This was, I understand, held in Belfast Castle, opened by the First Minister and the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Nicola Mallon, following a proposal by Alderman Ruth Patterson. It seems our Ulster friends had this event appreciating that there are some specifically male issues that should be addressed with both sexes involved. And I want to be very clear, I don't believe that there is actually an issue between men and women. I think that often the problems are stirred up by those who might be described as militant feminists and the politically correct males who sometimes pander to it. And you don't just need to take my word for it, Before the Equal Opportunities Commission was merged into the Equality and Human Rights Commission, it conducted research which found that women had very clear views on these matters. Their findings included the following conclusion: there was little support for the idea that women as a group are unequal in society today. Presumably that went down like a lead balloon in an organisation dedicated to fighting for women's interests and rights, and so it was pretty much swept under the carpet. And one of the most depressing things to happen, in my opinion, was the introduction of the Select Committee for Women and Equalities. After everything else, in 2015, we have a separate committee to deal with women's issues, on top of the Women's Minister, Women's Question Time, and the many strategies in the country which only deal with women. Now, again, for the record, Mr Gapes, I want to be clear that I couldn't care less if every MP in this House was female or if every member of my staff were female, as long as they were there on merit. And I want to say that to assume that men can't adequately represent women is a nonsense, just as it's to say that only women can represent other women. As a man, I can say quite clearly that Margaret Thatcher represented my views very nicely indeed. But I'm not sure she would have been the pin-up to many of the politically correct left-leaning women who are obsessed with having more women in Parliament today. It seems to me that we've therefore got this equality but only when it suits agenda in Parliament that often applies just to women. The drive for women to have so-called equality on all things that suit the politically correct agenda, but not on the things that don't, is a great concern. So, for example, we hear plenty about increasing the number of women on company boards and female representation in Parliament, but there's a deafening silence when it comes to increasing the number of men who have custody of their children or who have careers as midwives. In fact, generally there seems to be a deafening silence on all the benefits women have compared to men. Yes, of course.
Would you add to that list the deafening silence about the shortage of male teachers in primary schools, very important male role models?
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right about that. And again, we hear very little about that. If there was a great shortage of female primary school teachers, I suspect we would hear a great deal more about it. The fight for the version of equality on all things that suit women it ends up with a situation that we're very quick to point out that women need special protections and treatment on certain things, but want greater equality on other. And let me give an example of prison uniforms. Men in prison have to wear a prison uniform. Women in prison do not. How, I have asked on many occasions, can that possibly be fair? Where is the equality in that? And I'll come on to the treatment of men and women in our justice system a bit later. But this is a very clear issue. What is the explanation? I'm told that it's because women are different. So, as I said, equality, but only when it suits. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you for giving way. Congratulations on security. I may not agree with everything he said up to now, but one thing I do agree very much with him on is the constant obsession around gender equality. Does he not agree with me that actually some of the people who have the worst life outcomes in our area, in particular, are working class men who suffer some of the worst health and have some of the poorest life chances, and that simply replacing one middle-class privately educated man with a middle-class privately educated woman is doing very little to increase the diversity and opportunity for working-class lads.
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend, and I think increasingly working-class boys are some of the ones who are doing the worst at school and need the most help, and I certainly agree with him in that regard in terms of political representation. I've often said that replacing Rupert from Kensington and Chelsea with Jemima from Kensington and Chelsea doesn't do much for diversity in the House of Commons, but that's perhaps a debate for another day. Of course, there are some people who believe that only men can be sexist. Francis Crook of the Howard League for Penal Reform, for example, tweeted the following a few years ago: "Sexism is not about choosing between two genders, it's about historic and current oppression by men. Only men can be sexist." This is not uncommon, but it is, I believe, unguided. A good example of this, with regard to sexism, is my view that if it's not okay for a man to be sexist, then it cannot be okay to be sexist as a woman. A good example of this is positive discrimination, which is portrayed as a great thing, a rebalancer for oppressed females. Yet it is just discrimination, whether you put the word positive in front of it or not. It is still discrimination. In my opinion, there is absolutely nothing positive at all about positive discrimination, and it's certainly nothing to do with equality. just a few months ago, a publishing house declared that they were not going to accept any male authors for a year to redress some perceived discrimination against female authors. I never quite understood that because, as far as I can see, there are plenty of published female authors. But leaving that aside, people were commending the publishers for their stance. Now, just imagine if another publisher had said that they were not going to publish female authors. There would be an outcry. Thankfully, the Equality and Human Rights Commission agreed with me that this would be unlawful when I put in a complaint to them about it. But it's interesting to note the number of people whose mind this clearly did not cross, because this was in favour of women. They thought it was fine. Now, I will give way.
Well, I was very grateful seeing this motion on the order paper to do with male suicide and male mental health, which is why I came along today, and I know some of my colleagues have done so. I would be very grateful, as I think I disagree with some of the points he has been making about the broader equality agenda, but could we perhaps move on to the conversation about male mental health, where I think there are some very important things to be said?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. If she'd been a little more patient, I was just coming on to male suicide, but I was setting the context in which this debate, which is also, if she looks at the order paper, is about International Men's Day, and it's not just limited to male suicide. But as it happens, if she'd just been a little more patient, I am now actually coming on to the issue of male suicide. But I'm glad I've been able to set the scene, and I'm sorry that actually pointing out that men are sometimes badly treated in the world is so discomforting for her to have to listen to. But that's part of the problem we have in this House. The motion... Yes, I will.
Does the honourable gentleman agree with me that gender politics needs to be more collaborative in style, and that we shouldn't be antagonising either sex in order to achieve equality? Real equality is not achieved by causing upset or offence to either men or women.
I very much agree, and I hope that this will be part of the day that men's issues were treated as importantly in this House as female issues. And if that's what my honourable friend is saying, I'm all for it, and I hope that this debate helps us move that on. Now, the motion we are debating today, as my honourable friend pointed out, specifically mentions male suicide. And I wanted to deal with this subject in particular, as suicide is desperately sad, and it's clear that more men than women take their own lives each year. In fact, the figures show that around 3/4 of all people who commit suicide are men. And I would like to place on record the fact that whilst men are more likely to commit suicide than women, those I will in a second. Those left behind grieving will be from both sexes, and often children too. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Lynn Moon.
Thank you, Mr Gapes. Can I point out to everyone in the room, please, that no one in this country committed suicide since 1961, when suicide was no longer a crime. You commit murder, you commit burglary, you commit arson, you don't commit suicide. You take your own life, but you don't commit. Commit is a word that relates to a crime. Suicide is not a crime.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for picking me up again. This is, as far as I can see, a terminology. It may be important to some people, but I'm afraid if I'm going to be chastised for using the word that is used by every member of the public, as far as I can see, whenever they discuss this issue, I do apologise. But let's not get bogged down, if we don't mind, in politically correct terminology. I'd much prefer we actually dealt with the issue that I'm trying to raise. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you very much for giving way. Can I just say, as somebody who has had a member of family commit suicide, I'm perfectly happy with the use of that term, and I do think it's politically correct to talk about some other terminology to make it more acceptable to others.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that. Let's hope... Well, as long as we're going to get onto a serious debate about the issue, then I will give way to the honourable... I know she knows a lot about this issue. If she wants to make a sensible point, I'll be very happy to give way to her.
I only ever do make sensible points on the issue of suicide, on which I do spend a considerable amount of my time. I can tell the honourable gentleman that for many families who have been blighted by suicide, this word is deeply offensive, and it does cause great distress because it's part of a feeling of alienation and criminality that enters their family, and it is for them an issue of great sensitivity. And I'm sorry the honourable gentleman is rolling his eyes, but that's the reality.
Well, again, the Honourable Lady's made a point. I would rather that we actually dealt with trying to prevent people from taking their own lives or committing suicide or whatever term anybody wants to use. The end result is the same, and that's perhaps the thing that we ought to concentrate on most, rather than just focusing somewhat on what we've called it, which doesn't actually necessarily help anybody who is actually a victim of it. According to the Office for National Statistics, the number of female suicide victims had reduced from 10.9 per thousand in 1982 to 5.1 per thousand in 2013. Male suicide rates in the UK were much higher, and virtually the same in 2013 as they were in 1982, 19 per thousand in 2013 and 20.6 per thousand in 1992. Whilst these statistics sound bad enough, this is nothing compared to the reality of suicide. According to the House of Commons Library, what this means is that in 2012, over 4,500 men felt they had no choice but to take their own lives. Given that there was an increase in suicides in 2013, the figure for that year is nearly 5,000 men. In fact, over the last 30 years, according to the Office of National Statistics figures supplied by the House of Commons Library, there have been over 130,000 men who have taken their own lives. This is a staggering number of people who have needlessly died, and a staggering number of families left behind, parents, spouses, children, friends, colleagues, all of whom left grieving and suffering. In fact, I will.
Thank you for giving way. And in our own county in Yorkshire, 81% of those deaths from suicide in 2013 were men. And taking back to the point I intervened on earlier, does it not agree with me that we've got to do more to intervene earlier, particularly on young men from the poorest social backgrounds who are the most at risk on this, either through unemployment, through low self-esteem caused by low educational outcomes, or through the social conditions in which they live. And again, this is a particular group of our society who the services are not necessarily best placed to respond to, but who we need to do better as a nation in intervening earlier.
Well, I'm sure, Mr Gates, that my honourable friend is right, and I'm sure most people would agree with him about that. In fact, in the time allocated to this debate, statistically at least one man will have taken his own life, which means that yet another life will have been ended prematurely, and another family will have been left devastated. According to the Campaign Against Living Miserably, which is supported by many individual charities, and who I'd like to thank for their help with today's debate, a YouGov poll this month, which surveyed 2,000 men, found that 42% had considered suicide, with 41% never talking to anyone about their problems. 49% of those who didn't seek help didn't want people to worry about me. A third felt ashamed. Nearly 4 in 10 did not want to make a fuss, and 43% didn't want to talk about their feelings. According to various sources, including the government's suicide prevention strategy for England, the suicide rate is highest among males aged 30 to 59. This has fluctuated in recent years between 30 and 44, but it's currently those who are 45 to 59 who have the highest suicide rate. So we might ask, why do these men feel that they have to end their lives in these numbers? There is the obvious issue of mental health, and not wanting to ask for help could mean that this goes untreated in some men. The Royal College of Psychiatrists sent me a briefing which said 3/4 of all people who end their own life are not in contact with mental health services, and men who are suffering from depression are much less likely than women to look for formal help from mental health professionals. There are also clearly other things that are likely to affect men more than women, for example, being in debt or being a war veteran. The Samaritans point to evidence that suicidal behaviour comes about as a result of a complex interaction of a number of factors. In the case of men, financial worries play a big part, so unemployment and redundancy can be a trigger, and also the influence of a historical culture of masculinity. In some cases, men might feel, usually mistakenly, that they are a burden on others, or that people would be better off if they were dead. The fact that men see themselves as being the providers still in many cases means that financial hardship is very significant, and in their mind reduces their contribution to the family unit. In the case of someone in debt, they might think that their family would be better off if they were not there. Even putting aside the enormous emotional loss of those left behind, the financial gain may not be as the person maybe intends, as the taking their own life can invalidate their life assurance. Of course, I'll give way.
Thank you very much for giving away. A moment ago, he mentioned the importance of mental health care for men and men accessing mental health. One thing that is well known is that men may well go to A&E seeking care when they have mental health needs. And often A&E is the only place that's available in the middle of the night. And although some hospitals have got good care in the form of psychiatric liaison teams, many hospitals do not have good psychiatric liaison services, and these are known to be very helpful. I know that the Minister supports this kind of service and there is some funding going towards it, but can I ask that it is made sure that this funding does make sure that there is good psychiatric liaison services in all hospitals and transparency about the level of those services so people like ourselves can make sure that they are effective.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and I'm sure we all hope that the Minister will address that particular point when he comes to make his contribution to the debate. Shockingly, Mr Gates, 56.1% of men commit suicide by hanging themselves. I cannot imagine the horror of finding someone who has hanged themselves. Add to that the fact that this person is a loved one, and it's even more tragic. And then there are all the questions that inevitably arise following a suicide from the person's loved ones. Why? Why didn't I know there was something wrong? Why didn't they talk to me? Why did they leave me? What could I have done to prevent this from happening? The guilt and sense of loss that those left behind must feel after someone has killed themselves should be reason enough to want to do something. Never mind the absolute waste of life of the individual concerned. Suicides account for more deaths than road traffic accidents, and so you would expect the government to be trying to tackle this issue. Sometimes this place is also about sending out signals or messages. And the message I want to go out loud and clear today for anyone contemplating suicide is that you are not alone. There is nothing whatsoever weak or wrong in seeking help, and there are plenty of people out there who can help you. So please talk to someone, confidentially and anonymously if you prefer, but please talk to someone. Suicide is never the right option. The Royal College of Psychiatrists says we also need to work towards building a society where people should not be afraid to seek help for fear of being stigmatised, and where the media agree to responsible reporting of suicide. I couldn't agree more. And they say it's also important that information on depression and how men can get support is available in what might be traditionally considered male settings, such as football stadiums, barbers or pubs. And again, that seems like a very good idea to me too. Suicide, especially in the numbers we see for men, is a huge tragic problem and something we really need to work together on to change. One of the things that leads men to contemplate suicide is the breakdown of a relationship, especially where there are children involved. It's quite clear that the courts are more likely to place children with the mother over the father. This is certainly a massive area where men face very different treatment to women. I really do think we underestimate the effect on fathers of having to battle to see their children and facing the inevitable likelihood that they will come worse off simply because of their gender. I'm certainly not saying that all cases are like this. Many, many reasonable mothers allow their father as much access to the children as possible, and we should always recognise that. But life isn't always that simple in every relationship. Some women do use their children as a stick to beat the father with, either because they're bitter about the failed relationship, for financial reasons, or because they've moved on and it's easier for them if their new partner takes on the role of father to their children. Women can fail to put the father on the birth certificate, limiting his right, or lie to him about whether or not he is even the father. Short of a child swapping disaster in hospital, women know for sure that their babies are their own. But fathers can never know 100% for sure that this is the case without formally having a DNA test. Many are sure because of their trust in their partner, but there are also plenty who will be unsure because of their partner's behaviour or because they have been deliberately tricked. I've received numerous messages on the subject of fathers and their children, and unfortunately, Mr Gates, we don't have time to go through them all. But I just wanted to read out one or two, which contain the points many people made and which link the serious issues of fathers not having access to their children to the issue of suicide. One said, "Dear Mr Davies, a number of local fathers have been in touch with our MP, as I have over the years, about the way fathers are routinely excluded from their children's lives or treated very differently from mothers. I was pleased to hear that he helped." This was from the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Kettering, and this person pointed out that they were delighted that he had helped to secure this debate today. It's been proved time and again that children benefit from parenting by both their parents after separation, but it's all too easy for false allegations to be made in an attempt to exclude fathers. There are rarely any repercussions, and it can be many months before broken relationships with children can be mended, if ever. Sadly, I know of a number of men who have been driven to suicide as a result of their experience. Many fathers I meet at the local meeting I chair have mental health problems associated with separation and the difficulties they have experienced. And that's aside from other members of their families, including, of course, grandfathers, of whom my husband is one. I do hope something positive comes from the debate on Thursday. That's from Jenny Cuttriss, the chair of Families Need Fathers branch in Kettering. Messages from other people on the subject include those saying, I've spent the last 4 years going through the family courts trying to maintain a decent relationship with my children. Over and over again, my ex has been emotionally abusing my daughter and alienating me from her life. She has also maliciously claimed domestic violence and taken out a non-molestation order against me to try and stop me from having contact or being involved in my daughter's life in retaliation to me getting my ex's mother arrested for assault as she attacked me inside a court building. I was aware of the stories about men's chances when it comes to custody of their children for some time, and so last February I asked the Ministry of Justice this question: in what proportion of all cases heard in family courts, where both the mother and the father sought custody of their children, the residence order was awarded to A, the mother, B, the father, and C, jointly? The answer from the Minister was that the information does not record details of the orders, such as which parties were awarded the order. The information requested can only be obtained at disproportionate costs. But from everything I've heard, including from those who actually do the adjudicating in family courts, it seems that it takes something out of the ordinary for men to be awarded custody of their children, and it seems that the Ministry of Justice can't say otherwise. And the Equality Act clearly doesn't seem to apply in this area. If people think men have life easy, then they really need to think again when it comes to families. Women have an awful lot of control, and there is an inbuilt bias towards them when it comes to the very important job of raising children. And it doesn't look as if this is going to change anytime soon. Yet, as someone wrote in a message to me, I really believe that if the system worked against women the way it works against men, there would be hell on about it. Whenever there is any discussion of gender equality, the focus is solely on women being disadvantaged and never about these inequalities or those that you yourself raise or the many other areas where men are disadvantaged. The fact that women usually take responsibility for childcare is often cited as an obstacle to women's progression in their careers and underrepresentation in senior roles, and I believe that society's perceptions and family law appear to be perpetuating this issue. Perhaps more equality in family law and wider society could provide a win-win for both sexes, which seemed to me like a very good point. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Gentleman for giving way. I'm very grateful to him for securing this important debate, but I do feel that the evidence he's just presented has been anecdotal and there is no concrete evidence. You've just given us individual cases, and I am concerned that this discussion is straying down a slightly misogynistic streak.
Well, I'm sorry the Honourable Lady feels like that. Again, this is part of the politically correct culture we have in this place. At the moment anybody raises anything that affects men, people are accused of being misogynists. That is absolutely part of the problem. The Honourable Lady is part of the problem. Why these issues never get debated. Because it's raised as something to try and deter anybody from ever raising their head above the parapet. There are lots of people in her constituency that are affected by these issues. And perhaps she ought to go and consult some of her constituents about the issues that they face in these areas, and she may learn that it's right to raise these issues in Parliament. It's not misogynistic to raise the issues that some fathers in her constituency have in having trouble getting custody or access to their children. If she doesn't think that's a problem, then I think she needs to get out more, perfectly frankly. I will give way.
Order. Can I ask the honourable members, please, can we conduct this debate in a civil manner without it degenerating into some kind of arguments of that kind? I just ask all members, please, can we get back to the subject of the debate? I think this was an intervention.
It was. Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Walker.
Gates. My honourable friend has never been afraid to put his head above the parapet, and I think he is raising some very important issues today. We may not all agree with every point he makes, but actually I think he is raising some very important issues, particularly when it comes to family breakdown and suicide. But would he agree when it comes to the issue of men's role in the family, reforms to create equal parental leave are important in fostering that role, and it's vitally important that the government continues to pursue things like the family tests to ensure that we try to avoid the causes of family breakdown, which are a great problem for men as well as for women, in every opportunity we can.
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend that we need to do more to make sure that we have genuine equality, not the equality when it suits a gender, and that we need to do as much as possible to help families stay together wherever that's possible. Absolutely. Now, on to violence, Mr. Gates. In this House, we always seem to be hearing about strategies for combating violence against women and girls. In fact, there have been specific debates in this House on just this very subject. And so people might be forgiven for thinking that there is a special problem in relation to violence against women and girls, which does not apply to men and boys. Some might think that there must be far more women and girls who are victims of violence than men and boys as a result. But the reality does not always match the concerns people seem to have. It's a fact that in this country, men are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than women. The Ministry of Justice's most recent biennial statistics on the representation of females and males in the criminal justice system confirmed that 1.4% of women interviewed in the crime survey reported being a victim of a violent crime, compared to 2.3% of men. And it's not just when considering violence generally where men do worse than women. Women accounted for around 30% of all recorded homicide victims between 2006-7 and 2012-13, while men were the victims in the remaining 70% of cases. The picture emerging here is that men and boys are by far the more likely victims of violence and murders than women and girls, and yet there is little or no mention of them in the debates we have had and the strategies that have been drawn up in relation to females. So I asked the following question of the Secretary of State for Education in Parliament last November: what her policy is on educating children about violence against men and boys. I also asked what her policy is on educating boys about domestic violence against men and boys. The reply from the Schools Minister was that education has an important role to play in encouraging young people to build healthy relationships and to identify those relationships which are unhealthy. Pupils may be taught about violence against men and boys in personal, social, health and economic education. And so I will just leave that there for people to reflect on. There has also been a lot of talk about domestic violence and the female victims of violence in that context. The Office of National Statistics show that 8.5% of women were victims of domestic violence in 2013-14, but so were 4.5% of men. That's equivalent to 1.4 million female victims, but around about 700,000 male victims of domestic violence. This figure does not refer to partner abuse, but to all abuse in a domestic setting, including amongst families. And when you look at the figures for partner abuse, 5.9% of women and 2.9% of men report being victims. So it's quite clear from this that around 1 in 3 victims are men. Yes.
I think he's I wanted to make a speech, but I've got constituents visiting, and he's making a really important point about domestic violence towards men, but the fact still remains most domestic violence is towards women. So does he agree with me that actually, whilst we should tackle that, International Men's Day is the perfect opportunity for men to stand up, as part of the White Ribbon campaign, which I'm pleased to be an ambassador for, to say that we will never remain silent as men when other men commit violence against women. Both of them are really important, and raising the issue of domestic violence to men is important. But International Men's Day offers a particular opportunity for men to take a stand against other men who commit violence against women.
Absolutely. My honourable friend is absolutely right. All such violence is unacceptable, whoever the perpetrator is, whether it's a male perpetrator or a female perpetrator, whether it's a male victim or a female victim. And that is absolutely my point 100%. We should criticise them all equally. There is also evidence of underreporting amongst male victims of domestic violence. In the crime survey for England and Wales, victims of partner abuse in the previous 12 months were asked who they had spoken to about the abuse they experienced. A third of all victims told someone in an official position about the abuse, but nearly twice as many women as men did, and perhaps even more significantly, women were nearly 3 times more likely to tell the police than men. So despite what we might think, given the focus there is on male perpetrators of domestic violence, there are also many female perpetrators. And when anyone says domestic violence, the first thing that springs to most people's mind, including my own, Mr. Gapes, is a poor woman being attacked by a bullying man. Yet the figures show that it's much more complex than that, and this stereotypical image needs to be smashed if we're to tackle the problem as a whole. Something else that needs to change is the reaction to violence against males, certainly when it becomes to female-on-male violence. For some, it's almost seen as a laughing matter, yet nobody would be laughing or turning a blind eye if the female was victim. There is anecdotal evidence which suggests that male victims are treated differently to female victims by the police and other agencies. Given the sheer numbers involved, male victims are also hardly given any resources compared to female victims. There should be resources available to both male and female victims of domestic violence. Issues like the lack of places of refuge and the lack of support for men is something which needs to be addressed. For example, the Mankind Initiative, which works with men suffering from domestic violence or domestic abuse, says it will run out of funding in January. They need people to back them now so they can provide the emotional support and practical information to male victims. There are moving stories from men who have suffered domestic violence on their website. And despite the fact that they may seem to be more female victims of domestic abuse, each male victim is also a person and not a statistic. It's only right and fair that help should be there for victims of both sentences. The final issue, Mr. Gapes, I've gone on longer than I thought because I've taken so many interventions, but one final issue I want to raise is about sentencing and how men are treated differently to women in our criminal justice system. I had a debate here in Westminster Hall 3 years ago when I had plenty of statistical evidence to show that women were treated more leniently than men, but that didn't seem to be accepted at the time. Since then, progress has been made because this fact is now broadly accepted. For far too long, those who had been peddling myths had been able to get away with it because people had simply repeated their mantra without question. People now might want to try and explain why women should be treated more favourably in the criminal justice system, but at least people now accept that they are. Since that debate, I've also amassed much more evidence on the subject, and I won't go through all of that now, as we'd be here all day, but I do want to put some of the key facts on the record. About 5% of the prison population at any one time in recent history has been female. The other 95% has been male. Yet there has always been so much consternation, time and effort exuded over the very small number of women in prison. For every category of offence, men are more likely to be sent to prison than women. That is a fact. Just to give an example to illustrate this, 45% of men sentenced for an offence of violence against the person will be given a custodial sentence, compared to just 23% of women. Of those with 15 or more previous convictions, 39% of men, but only 29% of women are sent to immediate custody. In Crown Courts, dealing with the most serious offences, probation recommends immediate custody in 24% of cases for male offenders and just 11% of those with female offenders. The average sentence length for indictable offences is 17.7 months for men, 11.6 months for women. Men serve on average 52% of their prison sentence, women serve on average 46%. The average time spent in a prison cell by men in a day was 14.1 hours, it was 11.5 hours for women. The list is endless. One additional fact is, in the mention of domestic violence, is that 3,750 male sentenced prisoners were victims of domestic violence, compared to 1,323 female prisoners. Then there's been the rise of publicity surrounding female paedophiles. There have been a few high-profile cases recently where the sentence given to the women were much more lenient than those that would be given to men. Just the other week, we had the case of a babysitter who had sex with an 11-year-old boy and still escaped jail. There is no way on this planet that a male who had sex with an 11-year-old girl would have avoided prison, something that the NSPCC made in their remarks about the case. No chance at all. And yet that was the sentence handed down. These facts and figures show there are certainly questions to be answered in relation to the treatment of men compared to women in the justice system. it seems that there is clear discrimination against men. So if outcomes are all important, then what do people have to say about this? What's going to be done to deal with this balance? Well, the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Women, Equalities and Family Justice has made an announcement. She's just said that she wants to see fewer women in prison. Not fewer people, not fewer men. Yes, you heard me right, just fewer women. In fact, the Conservative, I will in a second, the Conservative manifesto said, we will improve the treatment of women offenders, exploring how new technology may enable more women to serve their sentence in the community. Now, I'm not someone who's going to be supporting prisoners, but where on earth is the equality in that? How does that fit in with the Equality Act? I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Does the honourable member consider that more women in the prison population is therefore desirable in the objective of achieving equality?
Yeah, yes, I think I'd like to see more people in prison, but that's a debate for another day. But I would certainly like to see women who commit serious offences sent to prison in the way that men who commit serious offences are sent to prison. Absolutely, I would. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for allowing me to make that point very clear. Where is the equality in the current sentencing regime? It's just like the example I gave of female prisoners not having to wear a uniform. Somehow the fact that hardly any women are in prison in the first place seems to be a problem just because it is. Well, it is just because they're women. If there is to be true equality in this country, then this cannot be allowed to continue. We should be gender blind when it comes to sentencing, if that's what the equality agenda is all about. If women commit serious crimes that are enough to warrant prison sentences, then they should serve them in prison. And we need to stop pussyfooting around when it comes to female offenders. Just like a judge in my local Crown Court, when he recently said to a female offender, I have every sympathy for your children, but the biggest burden they labour under is that their mother is a drunken thug. I couldn't have put it better myself before rightly sending her to prison. So, Mr Gapes, there are so many other areas where men are being discriminated against, or where they are suffering more than women. I can't go through them all now, unfortunately, and if they're not raised by other members today, I hope we will have similar debates in the future so that I will be able to highlight the further problems faced by men. Some issues I didn't have time to include are things like male circumcision and the effects this has on some men, the fact that men suffer from anorexia and bulimia too, the health effects of men not seeking help early enough to prevent their conditions from getting worse, the fact that men tend to live shorter lives than women, or the fact that boys underachieve in schools. But to conclude my remarks for now, I would like to say that I see this debate as a fantastic opportunity to deal with the issues that affect men. This Parliament should not be hijacked by those who want to constantly engage in perpetuating myths about men and women that are simply not accurate. Some people cannot see common sense for the blur of their rose-tinted, politically correct glasses. But I hope the message goes out around the country that we politicians are not all blind, and I hope that many of the men who contacted me today to say that they've never felt that anybody has reflected the problems that they faced, I hope they feel reassured that they do have a voice in Parliament, but on all issues that affect them just as much as everybody else. For a parliamentary democracy to work, everybody in the country has got to feel that somebody is speaking up for them. Today, lots of people feel at last their voices are being heard.
Yeah.